G'day, folks. Welcome once again to our series on Christianity versus capitalism. We are now in the final stage of it. So this is the last one. So well done to anyone. I don't know if anyone has been able to make all six. Perhaps you maybe for a prize for anyone who's been able to make all six, send us an email and we'll give you a free subscription to Manna Matters. How's that for a bit of Manna Gum largesse? So well done if that's you. But we're here. So this is what things have looked like so far, as we've gone through a big, long story for pretty much the first four parts of this, and then last time we did this for session number 5, we began to think about us here and now, our little lives, what it might mean to witness to Christ in the midst of capitalism. And so we're continuing that story tonight, and hopefully tonight's the night we're going to answer all your questions. I'm sure we'll get there. So just like we did the last time, I think let's just be a bit more open to, if you've got questions along the way, just feel free to interrupt, either unmute your mic and just jump in and let us know you've got a question, or you can put it in the chat box and Jacob can pick it up. I'm also going to pause along the way a couple of points for questions as well, and discussion, and whatever time we've got left at the end we'll also have for that. So let's get into it. So I'm not going to do too much of a summary, I think. Oh, by the way, I think Jacob is going to put in the chat box the link to the PowerPoint slides if you want to have a look at those. I'm not going to do too much of a summary of what we did last week, but very briefly, where we got to, the pointy end of where we got to, thinking about Christian witness in the midst of capitalism, in our context, thinking specifically for people like you and me in 21st century Australia, and we've got a few people from across the Dutch here as well, so for them as well. Where we got to is the pointy end is the being clear that if we're thinking that the outcome of Christian witness should be the overthrow of capitalism, then you're kidding yourself. We need to be clear that we cannot overthrow the capitalist world system. We're not going to do that. It may happen one day, that not ruling that out. And that's not to say we don't necessarily take part in working towards replacing capitalism with a better system or pushing it back. I'm going to, hopefully, if we get a bit of time at the end, we'll talk a little bit about that. But being clear that the starting point is not, for Christian witness, the idea of overthrowing capitalism, but it's rather the idea that we first need to learn to live and witness to Christ in the midst of capitalism. And in fact, that's really a generic statement for Christian witness in all times. All times are broken times in which we live in the midst of the powers, and we have to learn to live and witness to Christ in those times, and that's precisely our context with capitalism. So what does it mean to live in and witness to Christ in the midst of capitalism? Thinking about our context, particularly, we discussed that communicating Christ cannot be accomplished by words alone. It's not something that we just do through verbal proclamation, but it requires lives and communities that are being reshaped by Christ. Now, again, that's a generic statement about Christian witness, but it applies doubly so to our context, in which the church has lost a lot of moral credibility, in which religious and moral words generally are viewed with suspicion. And if we're going to communicate Christ, then it can't be with just words. We need something more. I'm not ruling out words, but there's a big question of what is going to help words communicate. So another core idea from last session is that Christian witness in the midst of capitalism involves what we are talking about as freedom from the powers. So we've talked in previous sessions about capitalism as being rather like the principalities and powers discussed in the New Testament, and that Christian witness is founded on participating in Christ's freedom from the powers. So if we think about who Christ was in his time, he was someone who moved in the world gloriously free from the seductions and oppressions of the powers of his times, and was able to call them out and challenge them and expose them for what they are. And Christian witness involves imitating Christ in his freedom from the powers. So that in relation to capitalism, that basically means remaining in some ways unseduced by capitalism or trying to. And also, seems a very simple statement, living well in the midst of capitalism. We might simply say that Christian witness in the midst of capitalism is an effort to live well in the midst of capitalism, as long as we fill out that living well part with a lot of depth and content and meaning. Another way of thinking about freedom from the powers and the task of Christian witness is this idea of expanding capitalism-free zones. So we talked in the last session about the fact that although it often seems like capitalism is all-powerful, it's omnipresent and omnipotent, it's not actually. There are plenty of places where non-capitalism can still be thought and practiced, and beginning to recognize and expand those places is one of the tasks we're faced with. And that begins within ourselves, in our hearts and minds. It's something that we hopefully extend to our household economies, that we can begin to extend to our faith communities. We're going to talk about that tonight, and begin to push even further into our local communities and the markets and marketplaces of our local communities. And even we can even begin to think about it supporting non-capitalism in global markets. And then finally, we can also begin to think about imagining and working towards post-capitalism in the sphere of politics, in public life. So you can see there's a progression really from the personal to the political. And that's sort of a little bit the progression we're going to follow tonight. And I'm not sure how much we'll get to say about the last. It'll be the least, but it's there. And that's for reasons of order and precedence. I guess we can talk about that if you're interested. All of that can be summed up really, if you want to put it in gospel language, as in one way or another, casting out the spirit of capitalism. At each of those points, we're working, if we think about capitalism as a spirit that's come to inhabit our economic life, our markets, our commerce, how we think about all of those things, work, government, and we're trying to push the spirit of capitalism, cast capitalism out of those things. So hopefully we'll get to quite practical ways of doing that. And finally, finishing up this summary of what we talked about. So that all points us towards the idea of witness to Christ in the midst of capitalism, being dependent upon what I'm calling embodied economic witness, which are economic practices which really expose capitalism and make clear what non-capitalism looks like, and in some ways point to Christ. So I talked about embodied economic witness. I propose that we can think about it in three sorts of practices of repentance, renunciation, and thankfulness. Actually, they're not three sorts of practices. They're three descriptions, ways of describing the sorts of practices that we're going to think about. Many of the practices we will talk about tonight could be all three of those all at once. What do we mean by those things? Well, by repentance, we don't mean just feeling guilty or bad about things, but the Greek word metanoia points us to the idea of a new mind and a new perception. That's what we get with Christ, which leads us to turn in a new direction. Renunciation is the idea of saying no to something, in this case, saying no to the false promises of capitalism, which means seeing into the false promises and seeing through them. And finally, thankfulness is the act of saying yes to something much more, to God's good creation and the community that comes with it. So there's a no and a yes that go together. We're going to think about these practices of repentance, renunciation, and thankfulness in relation to the household economy, primarily as a core site of witness, but also the local Christian community or the local church as a core site of witness, and particularly trying to think about the local Christian community as an economic community, which is something which I don't think we're very good at doing. And finally, we'll hopefully get to say a little bit about how these things might help us then rethink about reaching into the public sphere and that idea of working towards and imagining post-capitalism. So let me say just a few words about household economy. I want to suggest that perhaps one of the core tasks, if we're thinking about Christian witness in the midst of capitalism, one of the core tasks for Christian households is the reconciling of the households of economy, ecology, and ecumene within our own homes. Let me explain that. So economy, ecology, and ecumene are all house words. They all have their root in the Greek word for house, oikos. So economy, from oikonomia in the Greek, describes simply the management of the affairs of the household. It's a word we use to think about governments and the Reserve Bank and all that sort of stuff, but it really applies in first place to the affairs of the household and how you run and manage the household as a system. Ecology is a house word as well. It refers to the great household of nature, and oikologia in the Greek, our knowledge or understanding of the web of relationships that make up that great household. And ecumene, a church word, or from which we get ecumenical, refers to the household of the church in its fullest unity. So these are three households that we generally don't think have much to do with each other: economy, ecology, or ecumene. Or if we think about them having anything to do with each other, we might see them as in tension with one another, or perhaps even in conflict with one another. I want to suggest a core task of Christian witness is to begin to reconcile all these households within our own homes to reveal the truth that we live in a series of embedded households. So our households, if we're people of faith and within a faith community, are embedded within that household of faith. So we have our own homes that are then connected and embedded within a household of faith. That household of faith is itself entirely embedded within the broader human economy. We're going to think a little bit about that tonight. And that human economy, despite our attempted denial of the fact, is to this day, despite all our technological sophistication, remains entirely dependent upon and embedded within the household of creation. All of us every day still depend on the goods of creation to live and breathe and have our being. And that household of creation continues to depend at every moment, we're told in the Bible, to have to depend upon God for its being at every moment within the great household of God. So we live in these series of households, and the task of restoring economic life, if you like, to the way God intended, is to see them as households that belong together rather than are in tension or conflict. So one way we can think about that is as a work of redeemed materiality. So so often it's been thought that, that the Christian life is about escaping the material world. I want to suggest that actually it's around inhabiting much more fully the real world, material world, and redeeming it for the goodness, the full goodness for which it's intended. That's right at the heart of what Christian witness should be about. Okay. Oh, one final thing before we have a pause. So we've talked about household economy. The other thing we're going to talk a lot about tonight is the church as the faith community, the local faith community as a household and an economy. And one way we should think about the church is as a household of households. So the Greek word from which that we translate as church, ecclesia, simply means the gathering. And I suspect we often think about that, if we think about it at all, as the gathering of a bunch of individuals, which I guess it is at one level. But I think it's truer often to think about the ecclesia as a gathering of households. And what we see here and represented in this diagram is households coming together to a point we gather. The whole point of the church is to gather to worship Christ and to explore our lives of following Christ together. So it's this inward movement, a centripetal movement into the center. It's a movement of coming in. And that's one way of thinking about the form of community that the ecclesia, the church, is. But here's another way. When we are not in the motion of coming together, at gathering, the New Testament makes quite clear that Christian community doesn't just stop at those points, but actually continues to exist through these webs of relationships between households. So here we see the church represented actually as a series of and a dense network of relationships between households. And we might just think of these as, when we say relationships, people you might have a chat with or say hi to, or you might even pray for. If each one of those blue lines there represents a relationship, if each one of those also represented some sort of material flow, that is a sharing of goods or of work or of money, then we're describing a much thicker set of relationships as well. We're describing something like an economic community. So here I think a two-layered picture of the church, the local Christian community as an economic community. And in lots of ways, I'd say most churches are this in some relationship, even if it's only in very weak forms. What we want to do is to try and understand this a lot more and to thicken up these relationships a lot more. That's what I'm proposing tonight. So we'll explore that a little bit more. Okay, there's some concepts that we're going to play with. We're going to talk about direct practices in a moment, but let me just pause and see if there's any questions or comments so far on any of that. All good? Nothing?
Nothing in the chat.
Nothing in the chat. Okay, we might press on. Just as I said, if you've got something, particularly if you don't understand, if something's not clear that I say as I go along, then feel free to jump in and just interrupt with a question. Okay, let's move on then. So we want to spend a bit of time getting as practical as we can about practices of repentance, renunciation, and thankfulness. Sounds very religious, doesn't it? But actually, it's pretty practical, or I hope you think so. So these are the practices we're going to discuss. 5 practices. I've just called them the practice of living with less, of good work, of careful consumption, of economic cooperation, and of placemaking. So let's get into those. So beginning with living with less, this is absolutely the place to start. If capitalism is the system that always drives for more and schools us in the desire for more with unceasing, that there never being a point of satisfaction or contentedness, one of the core tasks of Christian witness I'm suggesting, and this is especially, so let me just make clear, what I'm suggesting tonight is contextual for people in the affluent first world. And I'm thinking particularly of 21st century Australia. And I'm largely thinking of those who are mostly within the church, who are mostly middle class, although we'll talk about some class, maybe some class differences as well, and how this might look different for different, depending where you sit. But this is who I'm talking to. So within that textual consideration, I'm suggesting a core task of Christian witness in the presence of capitalist world system, if you live in 21st century Australia, is to take on the task of trying to live with less somehow. Now, living with less sounds pretty imprecise, and that's precisely what I'm trying to be, is imprecise in that I'm not wanting to suggest a number. But what do I mean? What does living with less look like? What is involved? Well, to put it into more colloquial language, so we're talking about concepts which sort of exist out there in our culture at the moment under terms like downshifting or voluntary simplicity. These are ideas which get towards some of what I'm talking about, and there's a whole bunch of literature around those two words which you could look into. I am emphatically not talking about voluntary poverty or vows of poverty. Not that I have anything against such. I have high regard for the idea of a vow of poverty as a vocation, which some Christians might choose, but it's a very specific vocation. And that's not what I'm thinking about here tonight at all. Actually, what I'm thinking about is simply recognize, as a starting point, recognizing how incredibly wealthy we are in Australia. Most of us are in Australia, and seeing clearly that not just abundance, but I would say overabundance, and then actually to live well is a task of stripping back some of that. If we're going to live well with things, is to live with less would be a good thing for us, and it allows us to be more thankful for what we actually have, rather than always thinking, never thinking that we have enough. The idea for more is an idea of discontent. So we're seeking the opposite of discontent, to be content with what we've got, and actually to go further and to be choosing ways of living with less. And when I say less, I mean less than the norm. And that's as precise as I'm going to be. I don't want to set a number or a level. I think these things have to be talked about. They're contextual depending on your circumstances, your life stage, your family situation, a whole bunch of things. But really what we have in mind is the norm, both the actual norm and also the norm of what we're being schooled to desire in 21st century Australia, and to, with those things in mind, to choose less, actually. How do we do that? So there are some pretty practical mechanisms by which we live with less. The first one, which more and more people are doing these days, actually, is simply to choose part-time work over full-time work. So that's a pretty simple way. And so by working part-time rather than full-time, you're going to live on a lower income. Family, we see that this happen in families where maybe both couples might choose to work part-time. And obviously, choosing to work part-time is often not done specifically with the idea of living with less, but it's with the idea of living with more of something, which is time, right? And we're going to come to that. But one of the impacts it does is it means that we live with less. And there are lots of reasons to choose part-time work, which we'll come to. Another way we can live with less or be content with less is to be content with forms of lower paid employment. So they may just be the only employment that you can get for some people. So not everyone has the luxury of choice in the employment they get. And so learning to be content with what you get. But even for those who do have the luxury of choice and choose forms of employment, as many Christians do, which are ways of trying to serve the world for use-based employment, make choices from that. I wonder if you've known Christians who have made such choices that they're being underpaid. So I think one thing that we can do is to recognize, to go into those forms of employment consciously understanding that they are not as high paid as we might otherwise get, but be content with that. And specifically with the idea, again, recognizing just how ridiculously wealthy we generally all are here in 21st century Australia. Most of us are anyway. Another way of living with less, if neither of those two things are necessarily your thing. So there may be Christians who, for reasons of vocation and value and contribution, just end up in full-time, high-paying work. I'm not going to rule that as a possibility. Doesn't mean you need to live on a high income, though, if just because you're in high-income work. So there are a couple of different ideas out there. Ronald Sider, in his book Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger, proposed the idea of a graduated tithe. So a tithe is a form of giving in which you give 10%. And he said, well, that should be the baseline, 10%. But as your income goes up, then once you go to a certain income level and you can figure out what the gradations would be, you might start tithe 15%. And then if it goes up again, you might tithe 20%, and so on and so forth. That's one idea. I think a more simple and a neater idea is just the idea of an income cap. Is choosing a number to say, actually, for our household, this is a number that we can live well on. We don't need more than this. And if we earn more than that, we can just give it away. We can divest ourselves of those funds. And that sort of divesting is probably the main mechanism we see happening in the Gospels by which people live with less. So there's some practical ways in which you can live with less. What's it all about? Well, right at the heart of living with less is this idea. There's a very real and tangible reason for trying to live with less, and that's the idea is that what the world needs of people like us in 21st century Australia is that we reduce the material throughput of our consumption levels of our households. And the most effective way to restrain consumption is to restrain income. That's a very simple law. It's actually quite hard to restrain consumption if you have no other constraints, if you're just doing it by active willpower. As people in my family know, if you leave me alone with an open packet of chips, despite all my best intentions and all my critiques of such a thing, I'm pretty likely to finish that packet of chips. The fact that we can't always afford to just buy packets of chips whenever we like is a point of restraint upon me in doing that. That's a real example. You can apply that in a bunch of different directions, but that's a pretty fundamental law that restraining consumption is best done by restraining income. Another really important reason, and I think this is a key thing to get your head around for living with less, is that our expectations about a standard of living, what a decent standard of living is for us. So everyone has their own sort of picture in their mind of what a decent standard. What for me, what I could be content with. What's sort of the baseline of a standard of living by which I would my well-being would be okay, and it would match my we'd be a dignified standard of living, we all have a picture of that. The higher we set that expectation of a standard of living, that standard of living acts something like a life mortgage, just like a house mortgage does. So if you have a higher standard of living that you expect, then you have to find ways to pay for that. That means your service payments for your mortgage service payments for your standard of living expectations demands more for you. The lower that you can set your expectation of the standard of living means you, through your life, have a lower set of service payments that are required for that so-called life mortgage. So that's basically a principle of freedom. You can think about a whole bunch more options to do with your life, more creative things about how you can spend your time. You can start to think about if you have a really high standard of living expectation, then part-time work is pretty much ruled out for you because you're going to need to work full-time to do that. And maybe some other particular forms of work are ruled out for you. But if you can set that expectation lower, then you have more freedom in what you can choose to do. And we'll be having a think about choice in time and work in a moment. So I think that's a really important thing to think about. That's basically right at the heart of in the Old Testament when in the Torah, there are limits placed upon slavery, and God wants to get them out of Egypt in the first place where they are slaves. That's because God wants them to be free to be able to worship God. So anything that places a limit on your life, a set of obligations, a debt, which is what a standard of living expectation is, reduces your freedom to serve and worship Yahweh. Okay, so the other core principle that a lot of people, when they're choosing to live with less, particularly through part-time work, as I've already mentioned, is a choice for more, a choice for more time to do all sorts of stuff, particularly the things that make for flourishing, and including our next practice, which is good work. So good work is a very big concept, which covers a lot of things. Here, our particular interest is to think about good work as a practice which rejects our preoccupation with thinking about work just as paid employment, monetized work, and the idea of social status and career that comes with it. So you just say the word work and people almost immediately tend to think of employment. So one of our tasks is to fill out a much bigger picture of work, and particularly good work. And really in the New Testament world, that's the fundamental principle, is that good work is in some way work which is joining in with God's great work that he's accomplishing amongst humanity. Now, in some Christian contexts, as soon as you say joining in with God's work, people might think of Christian ministry or formal ministry. Certainly that should be included. But actually, I'm thinking about a lot more stuff. So a whole gamut of stuff that can be framed as good work. Being a plumber, if done right in the right context, can be good work that joins in with God's work, depending on how it's done. So there's all sorts of things, but that's the basic framework that we have in mind. I want to suggest to you that one way of beginning to think through good work is, particularly in our context, where we've devalued the household as a place of work, and we've devalued household work in general. A core task of resisting capitalism is the revaluing of the whole work of the household. And when I say the whole work of the household, I'm locating paid employment as just one component of all the sorts of work that get done within a household economy. And they include a whole bunch of things from provision of food and shelter, the feeding, clothing, and maintenance of a household and its members, care of children, care of the sick, care of elderly, hospitality to strangers. That's not something we often think as a work of the household, but within the Christian world, it certainly has been thought that way. And thinking more and more about the household, not just a place of consumption or luxury or escape, but a place of work and production, and particularly of good work, work to be enjoyed and to be pursued with creative intelligence. I also want to suggest that the work of household economy can be thought about as also a work of household ecology. So just as when we talk about a household economy, we're thinking about the household as a mini economic system, we can also think about our households as a kind of mini ecology that plugs into the much larger ecology of the planet. And basically, our households are the core sites in which we use the resources of creation and potentially abuse them. So how the character of how we treat and think about creation, and how we think about how our households and what happens within them, within these mini systems, relates to the bigger systems of ecology and the great web of life out there, is the work of household ecology. So in practice, that means thinking really hard about things like food, energy, water, and waste for all households. And if you have some yard, also thinking about land and soil and habitat and things like that. And really starting to think of our households as little ecosystems that fit into much larger ecosystems. And that's a work to do. Another work that fits into good work, and also is part of, I would suggest, part of the work of our households, is contributing to the labour of the ecclesial economy. That is the work that upholds any local Christian community. They all require work to exist, and the faith community has a claim on our labour. But so too do the broader communities that we live in. So thinking about non-paid work, and I'm using that word work reasonably loosely. There's all sorts of ways that we can participate, things that we can do in our communities that contribute to them that will never be paid. No one will ever pay anyone to do them. So you can see there, we've got a big long list of thinking about good work, and we haven't even yet mentioned paid employment. And if you're looking at that list and getting a little stressed about how much there is to do, you can see actually there's a hell of a lot to do, even without thinking about paid employment. It's a good pointer to the fact that I think it's true to say there's no such thing as unemployment in the kingdom of God. Actually, unemployment, the idea by which some humans are considered redundant, not needed, is entirely a product of a fallen economic system. But within the kingdom of God, there's some form of work for everyone to do. We're all called into some form of good work. And yes, that also includes our paid work. But before we go there, let me just say, I'm also not, if you're getting stressed by this how much work there is to be done there, I'm not suggesting everyone should be doing all of this work all the time, because that's probably not realistic. Division of labor is a good thing, and some of us doing some bits and others doing some other bits is important. But how we do those divisions of labor is important. But I would suggest that most of us should be involved in most of this work at some point in our lives, at least in some way or another. That's probably my hunch. All right, let's have a think about paid employment as well, and think about how the frameworks by which we think about that. I think one really important thing for those of us, particularly in the affluent world, middle classes, for whom we tend to think about work as something, paid work, that we choose, and we choose it by really senses of personal fulfillment. Some of us might use the word vocation, but it's something we see as work should be fulfilling. But actually, there's very many people still in Australia, but actually more broadly in the world, for whom that is not an option, and they have to take whatever work they can get. And that's been the case for much of human history, actually, that many, perhaps most people, have not really had much choice, if any choice, in the work that they have to do. But we all have to work to supply the basic needs of our household. And there is a fundamental human dignity in that, and it's dignified in the Bible, and we should celebrate that. Even so, and we need to recognize its importance and revalue that, rather than just seeing the only important work is work which is done that we do, which is either creative or fulfilling. Just working to supply the needs of a household is important. So I think that's important to say. Also, the question of, if we're thinking about paid employment, the big questions of who does it and how much do they do, and how we negotiate those questions within our household systems is something that needs to be done with a view to the whole work of the household. And obviously, I have in mind here the great gender inequalities that there have been in terms of how work has been apportioned, the whole work of the household, particularly through the 20th century. So with men doing the remunerating and high social status paid work, and women lumped with the work at home, that's been devalued and disparaged. And then women being later liberated to come into paid employment, but still shouldering the greater burden of homework. So one of the core tasks of Christian witness is to rethink that whole economy of work from the basis. Division of labor is fine, and in fact a necessary thing, but how we do that with a sense of fostering of fairness and fostering the flourishing of all members of the household is critical, and it's critical to the character of that household. Okay, so for those of us who have choice in paid employment, this is something we should think about with incredible seriousness, again, and recognizing that's not something everyone has. William Temple, one of the great archbishops, who was archbishop just of Canterbury during just at the beginning of the Second World War, once wrote something to the words of the effect, because he was writing to young people who have the ability to choose their work, which was still a less common thing. He said, if you have that privilege to choose your work without framing it in terms of service to God, is the denial of God of the greater part of your energy and effort in the world, which is and it's probably the greatest sin you can commit. He says some words, I'm paraphrasing, but something to those words of that effect. If we can choose our employment, then there's a great responsibility in that as to what do we do with that employment. And that sparks a whole conversation of how we can contribute to God's work through our paid employment. It means at a minimum, we need to choose forms of employment in which we do no harm in the world. And hopefully we find ways we can choose forms of employment that somehow serve the purposes of restoring humans, restoring community, restoring the earth. There's all sorts of works that we can do by that, including all sorts of things from not just teachers and social workers, the sorts of things we might think about, but including things like plumbers and IT specialists. They all have their part depending how we do them. A final thing I want to mention in terms of relation to good work is a concept which I don't think is generally being thought much about in the Christian world. If we think about the workplace as a site, the workplace itself as a site of Christian witness, a place in which we represent Christ and we try to follow Christ in the workplace. One thing we haven't, I think, in paid much attention to in the Christian world, in Australia at least, in our times, is that if we take that seriously, following Jesus in the workplace may often lead us into conflict in the workplace. So the Greek word for the word witness is martyreia, from which we get our word martyrdom. And it shouldn't surprise us that Christian witness has often been thought about as something that sometimes can come at a cost. It's my personal view that if there's any place that which following Jesus may actually have real substantial costs to us in 21st century Australia, it's potentially in the workplace if we take that seriously. Depending on the sort of workplace we're in, following Jesus, representing Jesus in that workplace may mean we are the pain in the ass employee, the one who is speaks truth to management, calls a spade, the one who talks to other workers about what's going on, the sort of person who may not be popular in some work systems. We could do a whole webinar on that, but that's an interesting concept to think about. I think that's part of, and obviously counting the cost and being prepared to potentially lose your job is something which involves being prepared to live with less and choosing another mode of economic living, valuing making our economic choices based upon different priorities from how capitalism would school us. Okay, next practice that we want to consider is what I'm calling careful consumption, what's often talked about as ethical consumption or responsible consumption, sometimes talked about as political consumption. I want to really emphasize the idea of consumption as something by which we can try to express care as much as we are able. So one thing I'm wanting to make clear here is that consumption here is not a bad thing. We often mix up consumption with consumerism. It's the ism in the consumerism that makes it something negative. Consumption is something we all have to do. And in our times, our consumption is nearly entirely mediated through commerce and the marketplace. That we don't have that much choice around that. We can make some choices around the edge. So if we're going to be consumers, how can we express as much care for how we do that as possible? There are a series of practices related to careful consumption or ethical consumption. The first is trying to buy less stuff. And as I've suggested, the easiest way to do that is to restrain your income. Another really basic one is buying secondhand. So that means that we're placing less strain on the earth by reusing things, and we're not sending a market signal for the production of more resources. A third practice, which is really a whole series of practices, which I can only just mention here, but requires a bit more unpacking, is choosing products that endeavour to show greater care for people and the planet in how those products come to us. And there are a whole bunch of ways that we can do that. There's a bunch of certification programs and ethical shopping guides that we can use. I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of these. So the idea of fair trade certification or organic certification, Marine Stewardship Council, and so on. That's a whole kit bag of practices we can learn. Simply choosing longer lasting and better quality products, particularly in the household goods that we use. And really critically, relearning, reclaiming the practices of maintaining and repairing goods. That is placing a higher value on the material goods that we have, such that we don't just throw them out and buy another one, but we're prepared to spend our time on them and not just money. And finally, I think an important appendage of careful consumption is the political act that goes with it. Is very often you might come across, whether it's campaigns to reduce slavery in cocoa and chocolate production, or where we're being asked to write a letter at a particular point. I think taking part in campaigns for consumer change are important addendum to practices of careful consumption. They're focused not just on our practices, but on the system itself.
It's 10-2 now, John.
Okay, cool. I think we're getting there. We're getting close to finishing off the practices, and then we'll have a pause. Let me just say some things about what we're doing with careful consumption. Now, I've just described the practices it involves, but what is really at the heart of the idea of careful consumption, is unveiling the fact that a capitalist world system covers up or hides from us, is that when we're involved in buying something, involved with acts of commerce, we're really involved in a form of relationship with real people in a real place somewhere. And acts of careful consumption are trying to uncover those relationships and bring them to the fore so that we can see them for what they are, as relationships with real people and real places. And their attempts to try and express as best we can, and it's always limited and it's never perfect, to try and express personal care. It's a movement towards the other through our acts of consumption for those people and places. They are also forms of saying no. By choosing to acts of careful consumption, of saying yes to this product and no to that, often we're in some cases having to choose a more expensive product. We're saying no to the idea that we can just we should be able to choose whatever we can. Imagine the supermarket aisle with the whole range of chocolate or whatever the good is, and how many choices there are, and that's, we think, our right to have as much choice as we like. We're restricting our choice. We're saying no to that. It means we're also playing a much higher value on material goods, particularly those that we choose to care for and maintain. We're seeing them as or buying secondhand goods. We're seeing the material that's in those goods as valuable and important in itself. Through careful consumption, often we're, particularly in things like fair trade, we're attempting to change the structure of market relationships. So we're pushing into how those markets behave between producer, retailer, and consumer. And we're supporting systems that have been set up to push those things in a certain direction. We're attempting to influence forms of production. So in agriculture, for example, or forms of production in manufacturing and some other areas. We're attempting also to change consumer behavior, to make more conscientized consumers, more conscious consumers, through paying attention to things like labeling and so on. And finally, we're being engaged in forms of social activism that we're making, sending signals to the government and to the corporations about what we as consumers would like to see. So the catch cry of the Ethical Consumer Group, who produced the Shop Ethical Guide, is "Your dollar is your vote." It's a way of sending a signal in the market, which governments also pay attention to, of where you want to see things go. Okay, economic cooperation. Now, so far, we've been talking about practices which largely we might restrict only to the household, or think primarily in terms of a single household practicing. But here we're beginning to think directly about practices which connect households. And I think this is perhaps the one area that those of us in 21st century Australia know least about, or we've lost the skills at the most. So in history, many people have done this naturally, and in many places of the world, they still do this very naturally, but it's something we've lost the skills on and we need to relearn. Ideas of how we work together to mutually support our economic lives. So some basic concepts. I want to suggest that the foundation of economic community are the ideas of shared work and shared property in one form or another. That can take multiple forms. Now, obviously, the thing that jumps to, if we think about Christian economic communities, most people think of Acts chapter 2, where there is shared work and shared property going on, and that might seem a pretty intimidating example. But I want to suggest there's much more modest and small ways we can begin to think about and step into the ideas of shared work and shared property, some of which are quite ordinary, and some of which many of you are probably already doing at some level as well, but we can do more and think think more consciously about. Another core concept about economic cooperation, I think, which is foundational, is that it is really made more possible by geographic proximity, by living close to people. The further we live away from people, particularly spread across large cities, the much harder this becomes. If you a faith community is also quite close to a community of geographic proximity, then a lot more is possible for a faith community where people are spread broadly geographically. So what sort of practices does economic cooperation involve? At its most basic level, it just involves acts of material support. So when there's sickness or crisis in one household and people from other households show up with meals for that household, that is your at a base level an act of economic care. Now, often for the household in crisis, they may not really be in a state of economic need, but yet the act of supplying a meal is nevertheless, as well as being often very practical, a very deep statement of care, which communicates a lot. And it's something which it's hard to quantify how much it communicates and bonds people together, such simple acts. So this is, I think, these forms of material support are the baseline that we can begin to think about practices of economic cooperation. They can be developed. That was a very simple example I gave, but those ideas can be developed a long way. Likewise, the idea of shared work is something, so most church communities exist by shared work. So whether you're on a music team, to make the worship happen, or there's a working bee in the garden or whatever. Shared work is what many churches depend upon. But actually that same idea is something that we could think about applied to the direct relationships between households within faith communities. So working together in each other's gardens. So the idea of a working bee can easily be applied to a gardening project or building a shed, all sorts of things, working together in the community, all sorts of things that we can think about ways that people work together. Shared stuff is another thing which, particularly if you live near other people, can sometimes, depending on the closeness of the community, just happen quite naturally without people really think about, let's do economic cooperation. People just borrow each other's stuff in times of need. They might borrow a car, or might borrow a blender, or a whippersnipper, or a mower, or a trailer, these sorts of things. So we've become more... I think we find this harder because our general idea that we've been schooled into, that we should have our own stuff. If we don't have it, then we should buy it rather than just borrow someone else who we know. But the practice of borrowing stuff is something that builds relationships between people. And it's something that you can build naturally. So just the very simple practices of shared stuff. The next step up from that, though, is the idea of co-ownership. So not just sharing the stuff that you have and that you own, but actually going in together to buy things that you might want. So this particularly applies for some bigger ticket items that, you might not want, for example, things like a trailer. One household might think, I'd like to have a trailer, but it's a fair bit of money. And, I don't know if I would put it to enough use to justify. But if you've got 4 households who all think the same thing, then you might put in together to buy a trailer. Now, obviously, there are some... In doing that, that's a higher bar. There's probably some skills and relationship stuff we need to learn, but that's certainly something that's very doable, and there's people doing it. Another practice which some people know about, others have lost, is the idea of cooperatives, getting together to do things that we want to do together that each help. So, for my mind, the most logical form of cooperative for many faith communities is the idea of a consumer cooperative. So that's where people get together to, particularly for things like buying bulk goods. So, and especially if you tie it to ideas like ethical consumption, where you might be buying organic or fair trade, which might be more expensive. And if you can get together to buy it in bulk, it makes it cheaper. And by getting together, you're sharing in work. Their work cooperatives require shared work. You're getting together to work together to help each other supply something which you all benefit from. So you gain by your relationships together. And a final practice of economic cooperation I want to mention is that of income sharing. Now, this is something all churches do already at some level. If you put money in the offering plate, you're being involved in a form of income sharing incomes to release work in the church community, usually to pay someone, a pastor or a minister or something like that, to pay for the building. But actually that idea can be extended much further and in lots of different directions, that we can pool our incomes to do things in the community and often to release good work. Here's just a picture of, so in the community that I'm part of here in Bendigo, the Seeds community, a few years ago, we did a night where we just did we mapped together on a bit of butcher's paper the different stuff. We'd never really had a conversation about doing economic cooperation, but because we lived together, it's something that sort of just happened. And one night we sat down and said, let's just map it. And this is what we came out with. There's a bunch of stuff. So we were sharing our stuff, particularly tools and cars and trailers and stuff like that. Some of us had started to do co-ownership together. So things like whippersnipper and mower and a mulcher have been bought together, and now trailer. There's been a bit of organising together for organic dry goods cooperative. Lots of shared work and time and energy through things like gardening working bees, childcare, just sharing skills. So, if someone's either electrical or putting in a gate or something like that, someone who knows, getting someone to help you with that. And look, really big ones are things like, just having who's going to take care of your dog and your chooks when you go away on holidays. It doesn't sound like much, but it counts for a lot, actually, when you add it all up. So there's very simple forms of economic cooperation, but when we added it all up, we all agreed it actually added up to quite a lot of substance in our lives, and it meant something and went to the bottom line of our household economies as well. Okay, final practice, and then I'm going to pause. Placemaking, a little bit of buzzword in some areas. A practice of placing. What am I talking about as placemaking? Very simple. I'm referring to practices which strengthen the connection between people and the places they share. And what I want to pay attention tonight is the idea, the role of very basic economic interactions in creating the shared life of place. And the second idea is the role of Christian households and Christian communities in fostering those economic those interactions more broadly in the local communities that they're involved with. So I showed you, I guess, a model or an image of the local church as an economy. Well, here's putting that image into, I guess, an idea of a local community. And it's a very simple sort of model. But you can see we have a series of households, some of whom are bonded together in this idea of faith community within a local community. And they relate together within this ecclesia and form an economic community together. But it's not it shouldn't be an exclusive community. Of course, there have been Christian communities in the past that have done economic community very strongly and been exclusive. They've had no arrows going outwards into the broader community, but that shouldn't be the case. And that certainly wasn't the case what we see in the New Testament communities and the Christian communities of the first 3 centuries of the Roman world. And there's plenty of opportunities for particularly many of those practices we've just been discussing to bleed out into and to include members from outside the church community and to involve them and to make connections. So practices of placemaking involve things like what I'm going to call the church has traditionally called the works of mercy. So many churches have material aid programs or things like that, ways of supporting people who are in need. These are important programs, or at least they have been historically, ways of actually making connection and building connections in communities. I should say a caveat. They can be done badly, and they can have negative impacts as well. But done well, they should foster community. I also have in mind practices of just being rooted in your local community, and this is where geographic proximity counts for something. If the bulk of a faith community lives in a certain area, and we send do our shopping in that area, send our kids to the schools in that area. We use the healthcare in that area. We get involved in the recreation and the organizations of that area. We're being involved into and contributing to the life of that community with our time, our work, and our money, and that matters. So one of the throughout this series, I've said we need to be careful not to equate commerce with capitalism, and that's because one core reason for that is commerce is one thing that builds local communities. It thickens up the place of local community. Done well. I think this is the final concept, is that we can think about is the idea, what I'm calling careful commoning. So the idea of a commons is something we've largely lost. So the commons back in pre-industrial England was a place where the whole community could graze their cows. No one owned it, but people had access to it. There are places we can still think about, places of access where communities can get use and access and benefit from either common physical assets or common social infrastructure. So I think church buildings are a great example of buildings that can be, if they very often aren't these days, but can be thought about as assets there for the community. So you think of many churches, places with a hall, a kitchen, toilets, sometimes a little playground. They're often great venues for all sorts of community activities, whether it's community groups that want a place to meet, or whether it's even just local people in the community who need a place to have a party and they can't afford a venue to hire. Local churches often provide great venues. So there are ways we can think about the assets and the building of a faith community that can make them available as a form of commons for the community. Likewise, the practices of economic cooperation we've talked about. Things like cooperatives can be extended into and made available to others in the community. Okay, I'm going to finish our practices there, and we're coming close to our time now, so I'm going to pause and just let's see what that provokes. If we have time, I have a couple of last slides just to sum it all up, but let's see how we go. Let's first see what sort of questions or discussion things you want to talk about.
Bruce, Sam will go for it.
Oh, you're on that.
Yeah, I find that most of my actual kind of economic post-capitalist practice has more to do with people who are outside the church community than those who are inside.
Yeah.
And I resonate so much with everything you've said about embodying witness. But that needs a group of people embodying it. And often the people I find embodying these ways with are not necessarily part of the Christian community. So I'm wondering about words as well and philosophies as well, and this whole business of where it's all going. If we talk about the kingdom of God, and we have a whole framework around that. What do you think about this whole business of those who are able to communicate a vision of a macroeconomic post-capitalist space? I mean, Jesus talks about the victory over Jesus' vision of the kingdom of God has a sense of the imminent victory over the powers, right? So where do you run with that?
Just to clarify, Bruce, are you asking about how we work or associate with people working towards a post-capitalist vision?
I'm asking about the core question is, do we need a vision of the kingdom of God as not just as the things that we embody microeconomically, but a macroeconomic post-capitalist space.
Yes. So I think ultimately that's where we want to get to. So what I've really been wanting to stress, and perhaps I haven't made this quite clear enough, is so we do need a post-capitalist vision, and we need to have a. That's where my sort of final slide goes to. What I'm wanting to pay attention to is the need for us before leaping right into a post-capitalist vision. So the real danger there, and so this was take you back to the early 20th century. There were, I think in Britain, a whole bunch of Christians who had a very clear conviction, very clear idea that their Christian witness demanded of them that they seek a better system than capitalism. They were very clear that, and when they looked around, what the leading choice that seemed available at that time was the choice of Marxist-Leninism. This is before the Russian Revolution. So the choice of a post-capitalist, the leading contender at that time was one that, if you chose, actually led in the world, as it played out in the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution, in incredibly destructive ways. So there are real dangers with just leaping to a post-capitalist vision without learning a different mode of being. So one thing I've been wanting, and so the two things I've got in mind, one is that danger, and two, the fact that actually to begin to see new possibilities and to see, if we think that the kingdom of God is something that it has real content and substance, even though it's always contextual, it has to come in different places, then it's something that requires being experienced and seen. And we've been schooled in the world of capitalism, we have something we have to unlearn, and we have to learn a new mode of being. So I really wanted to focus on modes of being and economic embodied witness as households, and ideally as local communities, as much as a starting point for learning non-capitalism. But where we ultimately want to go with that is beginning to think about and extend that into the political realm. And there are already seeing people doing that thinking, most of whom, as you point out, are non-Christian. So what we become equipped with, I'm just going to jump to my last slide here, because this is really what we're talking about. So the practices I've been talking about are ways of learning what non-capitalism, a Christ-centered practice of non-capitalism, looks like. And then there's a question of how does it translate into a political vision? And so we've got the practices I've suggested already point in a certain direction. They point towards care for the earth, and we think particularly in time of climate transition and needing to live within planetary limits. They point to thinking about equity, justice, and care within the economic system. They point to the importance of thinking about well-being and community and how economic systems affect those. And then all that has to be translated into things like taxation policy, housing policy, industrial relations. So that's a work that has to be done. As you've pointed out, Bruce, there's already people doing that, a lot of that work. If we have learnt a way of a Christ-centered way of non-capitalism, of inhabiting economic life, we'll hopefully have a way of discerning amongst the various forms of options and things being talked about there, people with whom we can find like thoughts, groups and organizations, movements, if you like, where there is a similar vision. I don't think we need to be looking for exactly the same vision, or at least where elements of that vision are similar. And I think so what it helps us to do is to discern. And I think there are fellow travelers out there who we can identify as allies and colleagues along the way, fellow travelers, in thinking and working towards implementing a better economic system. And ultimately, I think the ultimate end for me is I hope we can learn to begin to speak again with a credible Christian voice. But in the meantime, I think just getting involved in the works that are already underway is a key and important thing to do. Is that getting towards your question, Bruce? Is that?
I think that's an awesome answer. It's very helpful.
All right, we've got a question from Clint. Is Mike still not working? One thing we've really struggled with is raising kids in the context where the church we're part of mostly doesn't embody the kind of witness we're aiming for. And yet we feel participating in Christian community is important. Any thoughts or reflections on doing this and or raising kids more broadly in a context where the flow is so contrary to the kind of Christian witness you're talking about? Being a Christian is weird. Being this kind of Christian is doubly weird.
Yeah.
But we want our kids to carry it forward and not reject it.
Yes.
How have you navigated this stuff as parents?
Yeah, good question. So just Clint, I know you can't actually answer, just to clarify, you are asking, is that that the actual faith community may not be helpful for in terms of helping school our kids in this sort of economy? Yeah, okay. Look, I think that's a real tension, and I don't know in an immediate sense what a good answer for that is, other than finding those people with whom we do share some sort of like vision, and practicing what you can with those with whom you can. I guess probably what I'm suggesting through this whole process is that one of the core works, and we do it bit by bit, is hopefully beginning to build Christian communities in that direction. What I'm suggesting is that, really I'm setting out a proposal of a way that we, an idea of, if we're thinking about, the church needs to change, and I think most people agree with that in 21st century Australia. What's the direction that we want to head? I'm making an ambit claim for that. How you negotiate those difficulties with kids is hard, I think. And I think there is a balancing line between how weird you can be with, in terms of with how your kids fit into the broader world. We do need to be countercultural, and that is going to be weird. But I think we have to think also wisely about how weird you can be without really also damage. I think there is the danger of damage as well there, in different ways of knowing you guys, I don't think you're near it. I think our experience has been, what has been really important for us is having some people who we, who get it and we share life with in some ways. And it's, it may just be a few households, but where there are similar parenting practices, for example, and ideas around, living with less and careful consumption, those sorts of things. And my experience is that the kids have valued being part of those communities and value it really highly. And, I think they learn from it as well, just sort of through osmosis. But yeah, how you negotiate, the fact that the reality of the church is that many churches are not anywhere near this sort of stuff. And, I think that's naming a hard place that we're trying to shift is probably the best answer I can give towards that. Sorry if that's not entirely satisfactory. Any other questions?
Nothing else in the chat, so if you've got one, just unmute and go for it. While people are thinking, I'm going to post a bunch of links. I trace down the topics, various things tonight. There's probably too many for any one person to be interested in all of them, but just take a look at the various things I'm sending through and they might be helpful.
Okay. All right. Well, we don't seem to have any more questions. We're pretty much right on our time. So final calls, unless there's anyone else in, I think we have we've come to the conclusion of our series on Christianity versus capitalism. I hope you found that Christianity won in the end. It will do in the end. That's my conviction. Yeah, look, it's funny, isn't it? 6 series, and there's still so much to talk about and so much devil in the detail, so to speak. But there we are. Hopefully, some resources for good conversations where you are with the people that you are with. Thanks for joining us, folks, on this journey. It's been fun. And stay tuned for more Manna Gum webinars. Probably, maybe not till next year for the next one. But the next one, I think, might be exploring more deeply the idea of church as an economic community. Might be the next webinar that we take on. Okay, thanks, and goodbye for now.